Imagine two massive operations. Like, both of them deal in the mass distribution of these fine white powders.
Yeah.
And both of them generate just astronomical wealth for the people who control the supply chains. But, they also both leave this highly documented trail of severe illness, devastated communities, just ruin in their wake.
Yeah, the parallels are pretty stark right from the jump.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. One of these operations is violently hunted by the state. Like, it's an illegal drug cartel.
Right.
The other one, it operates completely legally in broad daylight, protected by, like, a phalanx of elite corporate lawyers.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. So today, we're opening up a stack of documents that argue these two operations are actually fundamentally and structurally identical. We're taking a deep dive into a decades-long crisis in the Brazilian community of Areias.
Which is located in the industrial municipality of Camaçari, just for some context.
Right, Camaçari. And our mission today is to unpack this really provocative analogy and figure out how a legally sanctioned multinational corporation can mirror the tactics of organized crime.
And, I mean, it is so crucial to understand why this matters to you, the listener, right? Whether you live in Brazil or literally halfway across the world.
Yeah, because it's not just a local issue.
Exactly. The documents we are analyzing today, they don't just tell a localized story about one factory. They really provide this masterclass in how massive economic power, when you combine it with sophisticated, aggressive legal strategies, can just perfectly insulate an operation from accountability.
It's like a blueprint.
It is a literal blueprint for how bureaucratic systems function when capital just totally outweighs consequence, and how legal shielding operates at the direct expense of human life.
So to get into it, the ground reality in Areias is really where we need to start, because the physical data laid out in these sources, it's just stark.
It's hard to read, honestly.
Yeah. We are looking at an industrial plant currently operated by a company called Tronox. Formerly, they were known as Crystal. And this facility operates right next to the Areias community.
Right on their doorstep.
Literally.
Yeah.
And according to the environmental reports and the legal filings in our stack, this plant is the focal point of severe air and soil contamination, and it stretches back decades.
And we should clarify, we aren't dealing with just anecdotal complaints here.
No, not at all. The sources contain official reports from the state environmental agency, INEMA. And these reports, they've actually been audited and verified by the public prosecutor's office, the MP.
Right.
They definitively prove that there are massive, incredibly dangerous concentrations of heavy metals sitting directly in the groundwater beneath this community.
Which is just, I mean, that environmental data translates directly into a devastating biological reality for the people living there.
Yeah, the human cost.
Exactly. The medical consensus detailed in these reports, it doesn't just note some vague decline in public health. It points to a staggeringly high incidence of severe chronic diseases clustered very specifically in Areias.
Like what kind of diseases?
We're looking at widespread, acute respiratory issues, aggressive kidney failure, and cancer.
Wow.
Yeah. And the epidemiological data in the sources links these specific conditions to the prolonged daily exposure to the pollutants liberated by this exact factory.
So they're just breathing this in constantly?
Basically, yes. You have this highly vulnerable population that has essentially been breathing toxic industrial dust and, living above poisoned water for years.
Which, I mean, if you're listening to this, you're probably wondering how this is even possible in a modern regulatory framework.
Right. It doesn't make sense on paper.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
If the government's own environmental agency, INEMA, physically holds the reports proving the groundwater is full of heavy metals,
yeah,
and the public prosecutor sees this data, why is the state allowing this operation to continue? I mean, it seems fundamentally contradictory for the government to document the poisoning of a community and then just permit the facility to keep running.
It is a massive contradiction, and the sources actually dedicate a lot of time to explaining the specific bureaucratic mechanism that allows it to happen.
Oh, okay, so how does it happen?
Well, it really comes down to a structural blind spot in the licensing process. See, INEMA, the agency that possesses these damning contamination reports, they are also the exact same agency responsible for renewing Tronox's operating licenses.
Oh, wow. So they have the data, but they also hold the keys.
Exactly. Now, the regulations theoretically require proof of environmental containment. But in practice, there's this systemic loophole. The renewal applications, they get treated as administrative formalities rather than rigorous environmental audits.
So it's just a rubber stamp.
Pretty much. Inema continues to renew the licenses without actually forcing the company to present updated, independent studies that prove their waste containment measures are actually working.
That is, I mean, they are essentially stamping approved on the paperwork without ever triggering a physical site inspection that correlates with their own pollution data.
That's exactly right.
So, because the environmental regulators are fundamentally failing to act, this entire crisis shifts out of the administrative agencies, right? And it moves into the courtroom.
Which changes the whole dynamic.
Totally. And looking at the timeline, it just turns into a massive, exhausting legal war of attrition. But my question is, how do 100 sick residents even begin to finance a legal war against a multinational corporation?
They generally can't. That is the crux of the issue. The legal battle documented here is defined by this extreme asymmetry of resources.
Let's trace the timeline of this legal fight, because the strategy used here is incredible.
It really is.
So we go all the way back to 2012. At that time, the company signs what is known in Brazil as a TAC, TAC, a Termo de Ajustamento de Conduta.
Right, a conduct adjustment agreement.
Functionally, this is a legally binding agreement made with the public prosecutor's office. The company formally agrees to halt the contamination, fix the environmental damage, and essentially avoid harsher prosecution.
A pretty standard settlement on paper.
Right. But fast forward to 2025. The contamination hasn't stopped. Recent tests show the heavy metals still persist. And because they haven't stopped, the execution of this 2012 TAC now carries a fine of over 1 million reais.
Which brings us to their legal response.
Exactly. Instead of just paying the fine or actually fixing the containment, Tronox hires a high-powered elite law firm, Souza Dantas.
Right.
And their specific mandate is to avoid the execution of the very agreement the company signed 13 years ago.
And the legal maneuvering here is incredibly complex. But the sources highlight this really rare, powerful judicial mechanism that was introduced into this specific civil suit.
Okay, tell me about that.
So the case involves over 100 residents of Areias, right? And it's been dragging through the courts for nearly 20 years.
2 decades.
Yeah. Now, in a standard civil liability case, the burden of proof rests entirely on the plaintiffs.
Meaning the sick residents.
Exactly. That means the sick residents of Areias would have to somehow fund expensive epidemiological studies to definitively prove that the emissions from this specific factory caused their specific cancers or kidney failures.
Which is, I mean, establishing that direct chain of medical causation is notoriously difficult.
Right.
And incredibly expensive.
Right. It's basically an impossible hurdle for an impoverished community.
Yeah, sure.
But recognizing this power dynamic, the court in Camaçari utilized a mechanism called the inversion of the burden of proof.
Wait, so they flipped it?
The judge flipped the script entirely. The court legally ordered Tronox to prove that their plant is not the cause of the community's diseases.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The corporation, with its vast resources, was ordered to produce the definitive science exonerating itself.
I mean, that sounds like a massive victory for the community.
On paper, yes.
But the reality of how Tronox's legal defense operates is a totally different story. And just to remain completely impartial here, because we want to look at the facts exactly as they are presented in the legal filings, Tronox mounts a defense on multiple fronts to counter this.
Right. They didn't just give up.
No. First, they use a chronological defense. They argue that the environmental liability is entirely historical.
Because the plant is so old.
Exactly. They point out that this plant was originally installed way back in 1969. And in 1969, environmental oversight and impact studies were virtually non-existent in this region.
So they're saying you can't punish us now for rules that didn't exist then.
Right. The implication is that current corporate entities cannot be severely penalized for historical contamination that occurred under entirely different regulatory standards.
And honestly, compartmentalizing historical damage from current active operations, that is a very standard defense strategy in corporate environmental law.
Yeah, it separates the past from the present.
By arguing the pollution is a legacy issue, they attempt to just sever the liability from the modern balance sheet.
Furthermore, Tronox explicitly claims on the official record that they have fully complied with all the obligations laid out in that 2012 TAC.
Even though the prosecutors say otherwise.
Right. The sources note that the local prosecutor fiercely contests this claim. The prosecutor argues it is demonstrably false, given that current soil and water tests still show dangerous levels of heavy metals.
The data contradicts the claim.
Exactly. But here is the most striking outcome of this entire legal battle. Despite the landmark court order demanding the inversion of the burden of proof, The residents report that Tronox has simply ignored it.
Just ignored it completely.
Yeah, they haven't produced the studies proving their innocence. They just keep operating. It's like it's like a sports team that knows they're losing the game. So they just use their wealth to legally call endless timeouts.
That's a great way to put it.
Like they aren't even trying to score points anymore. They're just trying to bankrupt the stadium so the game can never finish.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism at play here. It really demonstrates the fundamental limit of a judicial victory if the system allows that victory to be indefinitely delayed.
Right, because time is money.
Exactly. The community gets a historic, precedent-setting win on paper, but because the corporation can fund endless procedural appeals and injunctions, the reality on the ground remains completely unchanged.
The heavy metals stay in the water.
The heavy metals stay, and the residents continue to get sick.
Hold on, though. This actually brings us to the most provocative claim in the source material, and I do feel the need to push back on it a bit.
Okay, let's hear it.
The authors of these documents look at this endless legal delay, and they draw a direct structural analogy between this corporate polluter and an organized crime syndicate, specifically drug traffickers.
Right, the cartel analogy.
Yeah, and just to be clear to you listening, we aren't endorsing this view, just reporting what the sources argue, but comparing a licensed, tax-paying factory processing minerals to a drug cartel, it feels like a massive rhetorical stretch.
It's definitely intense.
I mean, a cartel actively murders rivals in the street. This company is just utilizing the legal justice system. How do the sources justify that leap?
It is a severe comparison, I agree. But the authors justify it by asking you to look past the veneer of legality and really examine the underlying mechanics of both operations.
The structural parallels.
Yes. The parallels they map out are structural, focusing on territory, externalized damage, and the subversion of justice.
Okay, let's break those down.
First, consider the territory. Both operations purposefully target vulnerable, state-neglected geographies. A drug cartel establishes its base in a favela or a marginalized neighborhood where the state's institutional presence, like police, infrastructure, social services, is exceptionally weak.
Right.
The multinational, similarly, sets up its highest polluting operations next to the poor community of Areias, a place where political influence, media attention, and regulatory pushback are historically non-existent.
So they both exploit a vacuum of state protection.
Yes, exactly. Second, look at how they handle their collateral damage. In the business of drug trafficking, the violence, the territorial murders, the community addiction, that is all externalized damage.
Meaning the bosses don't suffer the consequences.
Right. It never affects the cartel leaders' bottom line. The local community absorbs that cost in blood and trauma.
And the corporate equivalent.
In the corporate example laid out in these documents, the cancer clusters, the respiratory failure, the poisoned groundwater that is also entirely externalized. It is treated as the unspoken price of doing business, but the corporation doesn't pay it.
The community pays that price with their physical health.
Yes, which keeps the actual production of the mineral incredibly profitable.
And when it comes to the legal shield, the sources argue the mechanism of impunity is basically identical, just wearing a different suit.
Right, how do they defend themselves?
Well, how does a massive cartel survive the justice system? It uses immense amounts of illicit capital to hire defense specialists, find procedural loopholes, bribe officials, and delay prosecution to keep the operation running.
The exact same playbook.
Exactly. What does the multinational do? It uses its massive corporate wealth to hire elite law firms like Souza Dantas. They file endless appeals, they renegotiate binding agreements like the TAC for over a decade.
Just dragging it out.
Right. They deliberately exhaust the physical and financial capacity of the local judiciary and the public prosecutor.
It's a war of attrition.
Exactly. One operation is violently illegal and recognized as a criminal enterprise. The other hides behind boardrooms, official letterheads, and the technicalities of civil law. But the sources argue the ultimate structural goal is exactly the same.
To maintain the operation.
Yes, maintain a highly lucrative operation at all costs and guarantee absolute impunity for the damage left in its wake.
And, to address your earlier point about cartels utilizing physical violence while corporations rely on courts, the sources actually include a detail that casts a very dark shadow over this specific case in Areias.
Oh, what detail is that?
In 2014, a local environmentalist who was actively denouncing the pollution and organizing the community was assassinated.
Wow. It shifts the entire context.
It really does. And the crime remains entirely unsolved today. Now, the documents do not explicitly name a culprit or formally accuse the corporation of the murder.
Right. We have to be clear about that.
Absolutely. However, they integrate this detail analytically to demonstrate the profound atmosphere of obstruction, fear, and ultimate silence that surrounds the area's community.
Because when something like that happens, it sends a message.
Exactly. When community leaders demanding clean water are murdered and the crime is never solved, it creates a chilling effect that really does mirror the territorial control of organized crime. It ensures that the vulnerable population remains compliant and quiet.
To truly grasp the weight of this organized crime analogy, the sources invite us to kind of look away from the lawyers and the courtrooms for a minute and actually look at the physical substances being distributed.
Right, the product itself.
Yeah. We are talking about titanium dioxide, or TiO2. This is the primary product being processed at the Tronox plant.
That is correct. Titanium dioxide is a naturally occurring oxide of titanium, and it's widely used as a whitening agent in paints, coatings, plastics, and even cosmetics.
And the authors compare the production of TiO2 directly to the production of cocaine.
It's a striking comparison.
It is. You have two highly processed, fine inhalable white powders. Both generate astronomical global wealth for the entities controlling the supply chain. And both completely devastate the vulnerable, localized communities where they are processed and refined.
The parallels are definitely there.
But the text presents a really brutal contrast between the two powders when you look at the end user or the victim in both scenarios.
Right. This is where the structural analogy highlights a tragic disparity. Let's look at the physiological reality of the victims.
Okay.
A person suffering from a severe cocaine addiction is in a medically and psychologically dire situation.
Absolutely.
But if they have the willpower, and critically, if they get access to institutional help, rehabilitation centers, medical support, they have a genuine physiological path to recovery.
Their body can bounce back.
Exactly. Their brain chemistry can stabilize, and their body can heal. There is a horizon of life beyond the addiction.
But for the resident of Areias, the reality is entirely different.
Completely different.
You have a person who's been unknowingly inhaling this fine white powder, TiO2, every time they step outside their door for decades.
Without a choice.
Right. And once that prolonged industrial exposure causes their cells to mutate, once they develop cancer or the kidneys fail, there is no institutional help that reverses that damage.
The damage is done.
Yeah. For many in this community, getting cancer from the local air offers no chance of recovery. As the sources starkly put it, their only horizon is death.
And the gravity of that exposure is really compounded when you look at the global scientific consensus on titanium dioxide.
Because it's not just a local issue in Brazil.
Not at all. The sources point out that the dangers of TiO2 are not just a localized panic in Bahia. They are recognized by major international regulatory bodies.
Like who?
Well, in 2022, the European Union took definitive action regarding this substance. They invoked what is known as the precautionary principle.
Okay, wait. How does the precautionary principle work in this context?
It's a regulatory approach that basically states if a product or policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or the environment, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls on those taking the action.
Ah, okay. Better safe than sorry.
Exactly. So the EU was reviewing extensive scientific literature on titanium dioxide, specifically concerning its use as a food additive.
And what did they find?
The studies found deep concerns about genotoxicity.
Genotoxicity.
Yes. Genotoxicity means that the nanoparticles of the substance have the potential to penetrate cells and actually damage the DNA within them.
Oh, wow.
And this disruption of DNA replication is a primary fundamental mechanism for causing cancer. Because the scientific panels could not definitively rule out these genotoxic effects, the European Union completely banned TiO2 as an additive in all food products. They decided that any level of ingestion was an unacceptable biological risk for their citizens.
Let me ask this on behalf of you listening right now, because the double standard here is staggering.
It really is.
If the European Union, one of the largest, most scientifically rigorous regulatory bodies on Earth, looks at this white powder, sees the severe risk of DNA damage, and legally bans people from even eating trace amounts of it in their food.
Right.
How is it legally permissible for a vulnerable, impoverished community in Brazil to be forced to breathe it directly into their lungs in massive industrial quantities every single day for decades?
It is the defining contradiction of this entire case. It highlights a very dark reality about global industry. Safety standards are frequently determined by geography and economics, not baseline human biology.
It's like two different worlds.
Exactly. What is deemed an unacceptable genotoxic risk for a European consumer going to the grocery store is treated as a perfectly acceptable operational externality for a Brazilian factory worker or a family living in Areias.
Just because of where they live.
Right. The biology of the human lung doesn't change across the Atlantic Ocean, but the legal valuation of that human life clearly does.
Man, we've covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
To synthesize this deep dive into the source material, the tragedy in Areias, Camaçari illustrates a perfect violent collision between fundamental human rights, the right to breathe clean air, the right to life, and immense corporate legal shielding.
It's a systemic failure.
Completely. You have state agencies like INEMA failing to act on their own data. You have a company hiding behind decades of elite legal maneuvering to avoid a 2012 agreement.
And the community pays the price.
Right. You have a community trapped in the middle, paying the ultimate price with their health, while a landmark judicial order to avert the burden of proof is practically ignored.
And I really want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Building on what these documents have shown us about the mechanics of the law,
What's up?
we are taught from a young age to view the justice system as a mechanism for finding the truth. We view the courtroom as a neutral ground where facts eventually win out.
That's the ideal, yeah.
But when a massive corporation can legally purchase decades of delays, fund endless procedural appeals, and hire elite legal teams specifically to ensure a lethal operation never has to stop, we have to ask a much harder question. Is our legal system actually functioning to protect society from harm? Or have the rules of justice simply become a luxury commodity available only to those who possess the capital to buy time?
That is a heavy question to end on, but an important one. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you. Keep looking for the mechanisms behind the paperwork. And remember, just because an operation is legal doesn't mean the system isn't profoundly broken. We'll catch you next time.